As the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center marks the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, we remember those who perished, the first responders, the survivors, and all whose lives were impacted by that tragic event. Among those whose lives were changed that day was a group of ERDC engineers who saw their years of work in blast effects and anti-terrorism building design research put to the test, ultimately saving lives. The foundation for this area of research started many years before, with work in nuclear weapons effects and later below-ground protective shelters, producing knowledge that would be applied to ever-evolving threats. That was when ERDC was known as the Waterways Experiment Station, or WES.
And every project was a learning experience, and that was what we did at WES, ERDC. Generally, our philosophy in those days was we didn't say no to a problem, and we didn't know the answer to the problem. If we knew the answer, we wouldn't be calling it research. There's a lot of details that you can alter and work with in reinforced concrete structures to make a structure that looks the same on the outside perform a lot different one to another based on what the details are of the construction details. So we learned a lot about construction details. We learned a lot about large deflection behavior, response to dynamic loads. And we then were able to translate that into the new arena, dealing with conventional structures and these terrorist type car bombs and those kinds of events.
Then in 1983, the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, presented an emerging threat to above-ground structures.
Now this created a new challenge to us, and a challenge to them is to protect those soldiers in essentially would be a urban setting where you don't have the distance to stand off and things like that. So you're going to have to create ways to give you the distance to keep those potentially suicide bombers away from you.
As the frequency and magnitude of above-ground blast attacks increased in the 1990s, WES's Structures Laboratory was sought out for its knowledge and expertise on the impacts of these blasts because of its world-class researchers, facilities, and support staff that could deliver valuable data and recommendations to various stakeholders looking to reduce the loss of life and injury from such attacks.
Well, Oklahoma City was obviously another big shocking event to this country, and we were involved in that. We had a big role in the forensic research dealing with Oklahoma City. We were tasked by the FBI and the ATF right away. Our first job was to try to help figure out how big the bomb was, and so we went to we measured a crater. So we were there and spent weeks there. Over the whole area, looking, collecting data and going back and trying to determine what happened.
A turning point in the research came in 1996 with the attack on Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia.
Once we found out this had happened, we started engaging with CENTCOM to get somebody over there to make some measurements. There was some concern that the size of the explosion of the explosive event was much larger than we were being told. And part of that was probably because of just reasons dealing with security and things like that. But we were asked by the defense, at the time it was Defense Special Weapons Agency, actually. It's now the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. They called us on a Thursday afternoon and wanted to know if we could run a full-scale test of what we and they thought the size of the bomb was, which was around 20,000 pounds of TNT. And we couldn't find a place over the weekend, that's really the time frame they were wanting, to do a full scale, but we could do a scaled version, do a half scale, which gets it down, scales at the cube root, so it gets down to around 2,200 pounds of explosives. And we could do that. So they wanted this information to be available so they could brief Congress, and eventually it would go into a report to the President of the United States. One of the things that we kind of had two basic things that we're trying to protect against. One of them is the collapse of a building, which is what you saw in Beirut. And then the other piece of it, what we saw in Khobar Towers, was also a lot of flying debris. So most of the injuries were from flying debris. The walls coming apart, windows, glass, all of those.
In order to attain the highest fidelity data, Mosher's research team turned to the power of supercomputing, which could make trillions of calculations per second, enabling the development of models that could predict the direction and range of how the smallest fragment of glass would behave in a blast. The success of the research was also contingent on the talent of ERDC's unique workforce.
They all have their own expertise. The technicians, the model builders, all the skilled craftsmen that we have that can help us build these very elaborate models sometimes to scale. Not everybody can do that.
With solid data in hand, ERDC researchers could now assist the Department of Defense and State Department with designing structural protective measures that could potentially increase survivability in the event of a blast. The research team then learned in 1999 that some of its design elements were going to be incorporated into a renovation project at the Pentagon.
So during that period of time, we ran a number of experiments in Israel. We went, for a couple months to Israel. They had built a building, had infill walls, and we were investigating different techniques to stop that. And one of the ones came up, Dave Colthorpe came up with a way to take a geofabric and to work it like a catching system, hooking it, securing it top and bottom. And when the blast went off, the wall piece would come in and catch against it and not fly into the room, and then essentially fly back out, pop back out. And so the people in the room would survive. They wouldn't have flying debris at them. And then the other area we also had, a system had columns in it, and we did some experiments reinforcing those columns with different materials to try to keep them from collapsing. And it was very intense. We did a number of experiments. We were trying different methods. We were doing things in the laboratory, trying to get the right materials. And they had already started the protection for the Pentagon already, not the protection, but the rehab of the Pentagon. And so we were able to work with the Protective Design Center out in Omaha to give them some new ideas of how they might protect the Pentagon. And there were changes made to the rehab, the rehabilitation of the Pentagon to provide more protection.
Just see that.
Hello?
Crystal City, just north of Crystal City.
Just to the north of your town.
Give that.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, stop all departures.
Stop all.
Yeah, went in the Pentagon.
Went into the Pentagon.
Looks like it went in the Pentagon.
You're aware of the explosion?
Yes, we're aware of the explosion. We heard that it was a plane down. Can you confirm?
The reinforcing the windows actually made it stay up for about 45 minutes, stand 45 minutes longer before any collapse took place, where places in the Pentagon that hadn't had that were next to it, actually started collapsing the floors and things. So it made a huge difference. Probably the thing that hit me most was we had been working with a colonel from the Army, and he had been a technical support working group and been involved in that. And he knew what we were doing. And he was in that section of the Pentagon that was reinforced. And he called me like a day or two afterwards and said, "Hey, this is what saved my life."
And while their years of research was both life-saving and life-changing on September 11th, they knew that even more was going to be demanded of ERDC researchers in the days that followed, but were confident in the organization's ability to pivot to meet those demands.